We'll go ahead and get started. Glad you're all here. This week we're going to be talking about competent. Competent. He knew his stuff. What does it mean to be competent? We always have to define our word to start off with. Well informed. Well versed. Found several definitions. That didn't do it. There we go. Having the necessary ability, knowledge, or skill to do something successfully. Efficient and capable. And this last definition that came up, I wasn't quite as sure about. Acceptable and satisfactory, though not outstanding. Thought, well, that wasn't quite the term we were looking for our sense of competent. Qualified. George Washington. Have y'all heard the story about how George Washington died? No? December 12th, he comes home, and of course they were kind of farmers, ranchers. I don't know if he had to go deal with cattle or what he was doing. The weather is cold and rainy, and he's out working all day. They were having company that night. I'm sure Martha was just beside herself. Oh, he's not here. Our company's here, and he's not here. Well, George comes in. He is soaking wet. He's cold, but he didn't go change clothes or anything. He's just went on in and started visiting with the guests, and of course, the next day he comes down with some cold symptoms. He's getting sick. Well, by that evening, they've called doctors in. They drained 5 pints of blood out of him. They put a hot poultice around his neck. It was so hot it blistered his neck. And what was the other? Oh, they were giving him laxatives, trying to get all that impurity out of his system. He died from the treatment that he got from the doctors. But they were doing what they had been trained to do. That's what they knew. They thought that's how they're supposed to treat someone. So he died on December the 14th, 2 days later. They had good intentions, but that's just not enough. Could tell you some other stories about some incompetent doctors, but not going to go there. Competence is a key to success. You need to know what you're doing and be certain enough, and people who are competent, they have an air about them that they're going to be a good leader. People are going to be willing to follow someone who is competent. And in the book, Kirk Brothers talked about the fact that they interviewed a lot of like World War II vets and asked them about the leaders they had. And they said, if they were competent, they'd follow them anywhere. They'd do whatever they said. Of course, if it's a senior officer, yes, sir, they're going to obey that. But they're going to be more willing to serve them, help them, if they're competent, if they know what they're doing. Competence in other people. Pilots, bus drivers, ferry captains, taxi drivers. They know where they're going. They know what they're doing. The pilot certainly knows a lot more than I do about flying. So I'm going to have to put my faith in him to get me to where we're going. The bus driver, ferry captain. I don't know anything about a ferry. I've ridden on one. Going back to doctors, a surgeon has to be competent. I've read stories of people who are going into the hospital for surgery, and they're supposed to have like a knee replacement on their right knee, and so they take a Sharpie and they write on their left knee, not this one, just so they don't put the wrong knee in or something. Nurses, pharmacists, mixing up and giving you the wrong medication. Competence in our lives. Being able to read, something that all of us take for granted. We grew up in a culture where we read, our peers were able to read, and we just kind of assume everybody knows how to read for the most part, except for athletes. Sorry. But if you're not familiar with places, you're gonna have to be able to read the street signs. Here in a few days, we're gonna have to read a ballot, or just use your lucky coin. Arithmetic, having to balance that checkbook. You have to be competent enough to be able to take care of everything in your life. Mom worked at a bank for years, and people would come in and they were confused that, how can I be out of money? I still have checks. Geometry. That comes in handy when you go to pack for a long trip. How's this going to fit in the car? We were at home, and this just cracks me up. These three ladies are in this small sedan, and they have a dolly loaded with a bunch of chairs. And I thought, how are they going to load that? And it was entertaining to watch. They're trying to fit them into the trunk of this little sedan, and not one chair will go in the trunk. So then they're trying to figure out how to get it inside the car and twist it around, and it didn't work. They ended up having to take the chairs inside and get a refund. We'll have to come back and maybe buy these at another time when we have something that can actually haul it. But I see people do stuff like that a lot. I saw a lady at Sam's, had this huge cart loaded down with stuff, and she's walking out, and I thought, where is she going? Because the only car left, I mean, she's passed all these big vehicles, and there's like a little two-seat car with no trunk. And I'm wondering, okay, how is she going to decide what's going to sit in the passenger seat and what's going back in the store? Oh, and one day I was at the hardware store, and this lady is painting her house, and she has bought a 6-foot ladder, but she couldn't get it in her car. And so she was about to return it, and I said, look, I'm here in my truck. I said, we can put it in the back of my truck. I'll follow you home. And she's like, oh, really? And she was just so excited. So I was able to help a little bit. We have to be competent in farming, gardening, lawn care, just to do maintenance around the house, or if you're trying to grow a garden or some crops, some grass. Yeah, I don't know that I'd be out there at 2 a.m. watering the yard. Car repair. It just really surprises me at the number of people that they couldn't even change a flat tire or anything. Did y'all have to do that in driver's ed? No? Wow. When I was in driver's ed, we were going along, he took 3 of the kids that were learning, and we're driving along and said, oh, pull over. What? He said, pull over, go over on the shoulder. Okay, so we pull over and put the hazards on. He said, you're going to change a flat tire. Really? Even though it wasn't flat, he made us each take turns changing that flat tire. So I thought that's silly. Of all the flat tires I've changed in my life, even before I started driving. But there's a lot of people that don't know simple things like that. And one time we were in Amarillo, and a nephew, his truck wouldn't start. And it is snowing like you wouldn't believe. It's bitter cold out there. We went over, and so he said it's the starter, because the lights were on the car, on the vehicle. And so I get down underneath there, and I took his starter off, took it to the shop, and they tested it, and it was fine. So I go back, and I'm putting it back on. Okay, so the battery must just be weak. And so we were going to go get a battery. Well, it wasn't the battery. So, what is wrong? And then then I found out actually the battery was weak, and we ended up having to replace that. But he had sit there, he had run out of gas, and he sat there and cranked on it until he had run the battery down. And I just rolled my eyes. We got the car put back together, and I just left it. I said, I've had it. Competence in money management. Being able to, I mentioned balancing the checkbook earlier, but just knowing, saving for your future and planning. It just amazes me the number of people that have no plan, that they're just, here's my plan, I'm going to work till I die. One more area where we need to be competent in God's Word. We need to know more about the Bible than where we are. We need to continue to grow and continue to learn. Bible knowledge, biblical illiteracy of the world is just staggering. I mean, when you hear stories from Dale and Chris, people like that they meet people that have never even read the Bible at all. They're not familiar with it. That just blows my mind because, growing up in the Bible Belt, everybody's familiar with it. They know what Genesis is about and things like that. People in the world don't. What about in the church? Some stats that I found. 1 in 5, this is Americans. 1 in 5 Americans have read the Bible from start to finish. 20% have read it at least once. 61% of Christians have read the entire Bible. I kind of expected that number to be higher. Only 61% say they've read the Bible. 18% of other religions have read the Bible. 9% of people with no faith claimed have actually read the Bible. Only 11% claim to read the Bible daily. That chart shows it's a survey. They compared 4 years in a row that did this survey of how often you read the Bible. And down here at the far right, you probably can't read it. It says if they read it every day, is this group down here. At the far left is people that have never read it. And then in between, you've got less than once a year, once or twice a year, 3 or 4 times a year, once a month, once a week, several times, to 4+ times a week, 4 or more times a week. So anyway, and then each little bar is a different year. The red is last year's figures, 2021, and 11% is all that said they read every day. But if you look down here, the people that never read the Bible, it's about a third, 30% in all 4 years. 82% of American Christians say that the only time they read their Bible is in church on Sunday morning. Albert Mohler said, while America's evangelical Christians are rightly concerned about the secular world view's rejection of the biblical Christianity, we ought to give some urgent attention to a problem much closer to home: biblical illiteracy in the church. I'm sure you've all heard of George Gallup. He does lots of surveys about the church. George Gallup and Jim Castelli. Americans revere the Bible, but by and large, they don't read it. And because they don't read it, they have become a nation of biblical illiterates. That's sad. Staggering to hear those comments. Incompetence. Paul encouraged Timothy, 2 Timothy 3:14 and 15. You, however, must continue in the things you have learned and are confident about. You know who taught you, and how from infancy you have known the holy writings, which are able to give you wisdom for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. To continue in the things that you have learned. That word continue in the Greek is a word, it's an imperative, active, present active verb. It's a command. It's something, keep doing it. I heard a story quite some time ago. A person was reading their Bible, and they, I think it was a grandchild asking, well, do you have to teach class on Sunday? No. And kept asking questions, and finally asked, well, why are you reading the Bible? And they said, I'm studying for the final. Rather than waiting till the end and cramming before the final. Thinking about Jesus' childhood. They were raised under the law. They followed the law very strictly. He was presented according to what was commanded in the law of Moses, Luke 2 and 22. They offered sacrifices according to the law, in verse 24. Performed everything according to the law of the Lord, verse 39. The parents went to Jerusalem every year. That was their custom. That's what the law said. All who heard Jesus were astonished at his understanding and his answers. That's Luke 2, verse 47. And then chapter 4:16, he's an adult now, went to the synagogue on the Sabbath, as was his custom. He went to the Sabbath regularly. I don't know that he had his own copy of scrolls. Bibles aren't as convenient back then as they are now. Of course, now we've got it on our phones and tablets, things where we can quickly look things up. Back in Jesus' time, people had to commit more to memory. They relied on their memory more than we do now. They were much better at this. Jesus quotes from the Old Testament. 1 out of every 10 words of Jesus is either a quote or an allusion back to the Old Testament. J.M. Price said that Jesus quoted from at least 20 Old Testament books. Matthew shows Jesus' knowledge of the scriptures. Matthew, I think of all the apostles, Matthew was probably one of the sharpest ones. And if there's a quote from the Old Testament that's in the Gospels, it's probably Matthew who records that. And so he was really good about it. 63 quotes or allusions to the Old Testament in the book of Matthew. 43 are direct quotes, so that'd be 22 where he just made a reference to a character or something. His responses to Satan. It is written. Matthew 4, 1 through 10. He quoted Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 3, chapter 6 and verse 16, chapter 6 and verse 13, and chapter 10 and verse 20. So let's look at Matthew 4. Whoops, wrong chapter. And you can turn the pages so quietly. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After he fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread." And he answered, "It is written, Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple and said to him, If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and with their hands they will lift you up, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. So even Satan used that phrase to kind of twist it back on Jesus. Jesus said to him, verse 7, Jesus said to him, Once again, it is written, You are not to put the Lord your God to the test. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their grandeur. And he said to him, I will give you all these things if you throw yourself to the ground and worship me. Then Jesus said to him, Go away, Satan, for it is written, You are to worship the Lord your God and serve only Him. It is written. I'm sure he didn't have a scroll of Deuteronomy he could pull out of his robe, and he had that all memorized. Jesus' knowledge of the Old Testament, these verses are all from Matthew. Matthew 8:4, he tells a leper to go show himself to the priest. After he's been cleansed, in order to follow the law, he had to go show himself to the priest and let the priest declare him as being clean before he could go back to his former life, his regular life. Chapter 12, verses 3 to 5, Jesus mentioned that David ate the consecrated bread. That was in 1 Samuel 21, 1 to 6. Chapter 15 and verse 4, honor your father and mother, which is several references there, Exodus 20:12, 21:17, Deuteronomy 5:16, and Leviticus 20 and verse 9. Matthew 15, verses 8 and 9, in vain do they worship me, a quote from Isaiah 29 and 13. Matthew 19 and 4, leave your father and mother, reference to Genesis 1:27 and 2:24. Matthew 19 and 8, talking about divorce. Moses' teaching on divorce and that they were allowed to give a certificate of divorce. Deuteronomy 24, 1 to 4. Matthew 19:18, the rich young ruler wants to know what he needs to do. And Jesus starts telling him the 10 Commandments. All these I've followed since I was a kid. What more do I need to do? Well, then go sell all that you have and give it to the poor. Ouch. That would be tough. Chapter 21 and verse 5, reference to the donkey's colt. It's a quote from Isaiah 62:11 and Zechariah 9:9. He also mentioned Jonah, Noah, Abel, Sodom, Moses, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. He mentioned a lot of characters, a lot of references to the Old Testament, to the Scriptures. Jesus knew the Scriptures. He studied the Scriptures regularly. Committed a lot of that stuff to memory. This is a verse that keeps coming up in the lesson, and I didn't intend to, but we'll see this again later on. Luke 4:16. Now Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. That's how he knew the Scriptures, because he would go to the synagogue to learn more. He knew the law, so he could defend himself against Satan. He also knew the law so he could help others when he tells the leper to go show yourself to the priest. He knew the law so he could teach. Jesus knew people. He created them. John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was fully God, and the Word was with God in the beginning. All things were created by him, and apart from him, not one thing was created that has been created. So he created them, and then he became one of them. John 1:14. Now the Word became flesh and took up residence among us. We saw his glory and the glory of the one and only, full of grace and truth, who came from the Father. He grew up and lived like them. For we do not have a high priest incapable of sympathizing with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet without sin. Jesus knew the thoughts of people. Wouldn't that be neat? Be able to read their minds. Just then some people brought to him a paralytic lying on a stretcher. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Have courage, son, your sins are forgiven." Then some of the experts of the law said to themselves, "This man is blaspheming." When Jesus perceived their thoughts, he said, "Why do you respond with evil in your hearts?" There are several other times where Jesus knew what was going on, knew what they were thinking, when the apostles are arguing about who is the greatest. What were you arguing about? Nothing. We'd rather not talk about it. But can you imagine having the ability to be able to read people's minds? I had a friend in high school, and we spent so much time together. And I mean, every weekend we're out on a farm pond fishing, and we spent so much time together that we could finish each other's sentences, and we would both see something and just look at each other, and we'd start laughing because we knew what we wanted to say but didn't. I can't imagine having the ability to actually be able to read someone's mind, but sometimes you can kind of perceive their thoughts. Knew their thoughts, part 2. There's actually 3 screens of verses where he knew their thoughts. On another Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue and was teaching. Now a man was there whose right hand was withered. The experts in the law and the Pharisees watched Jesus closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they could find a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Get up and stand here." So he rose and stood there, and Jesus said, "I ask you, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil? To save a life or destroy it?" And after looking around at them, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." The man did so, and his hand was restored. Luke 11:17 again. But Jesus, realizing their thoughts, said to them, "Every kingdom divided against itself is destroyed, and a divided house falls." They're accusing him of healing by the powers of Beelzebub, or casting out demons by the powers of the devil. And so he said, a house divided is not going to be able to stand. Matthew 22:17 and 18. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar? But Jesus realized their evil intentions and said, "Hypocrites, why are you testing me?" Jesus had an understanding of all humans. He knew what they were thinking. He knew where they were raised and how they were raised, and so he kind of knew that thought pattern of what they were going through. He became human. He emptied himself and became human, and his humanity helps him to understand us. His humanity made him a great high priest. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, He is able to help those who are being tempted. Another verse I repeat. Hebrews 4:15. For we do not have a high priest incapable of sympathizing with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. The humanity of Jesus, he was born as a human baby. We kind of talked about this a little bit last week. And, was he a normal baby? Was he above the growth chart? Or did he walk before the other babies? Did he talk before the other babies? Don't know. I think he's probably just an average baby, I guess. I don't know. Luke 2:7, and she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn. He had to be protected. Matthew 2:13 and 14. After they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to look for the child to kill him. Then he got up and took the child and his mother during the night and went to Egypt. Had to be protected by Joseph and Mary. His growth and his maturity. Luke 2 and verse 40, and the child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. Verse 52, and Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and with the people. He continued to grow. Showing some of his humanity, he became weary, thirsty, hungry. John 4 verses 5 through 8. Now he came to a Samaritan town called Sychar. Oh, wow. Near the plot of land that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, since he was tired from the journey, sat right down beside the well. It was about noon. A Samaritan woman came to draw water. Jesus said to her, Give me some water to drink, for his disciples had gone off into town to buy supplies. This word tired indicates that he's been laboring hard and he is physically exhausted. So he is tired, and so he just sat down by the well. I can't even go into town to get something to eat. I'm just going to sit right here. You guys go to McDonald's and bring me back whatever. Go into town and find some bread. He needed sleep. Another part of being human. Have you ever been so tired you fell asleep on your feet? I'm the only one. When I was in high school, I helped deliver the newspapers down at Newcastle. And we had 1,000 newspapers that we delivered, and driving all over town. And some nights we could get that done pretty quick. But some nights, if it's raining and the roads were muddy, and we'd get home and I might get a 30-minute nap before we go to church. So anyway, I'm standing there at church singing a song, and I fell asleep and just fell over the pew in front of us. I couldn't believe that, but I've been that tired. Jesus was needing sleep. Matthew 8:24, and a great storm developed on the sea so that the waves began to swamp the boat. But he was asleep. That's hard to imagine. A storm tossing the boat around, waves coming over the sides, and he's sleeping through it. He felt emotions: compassion, love, anger, joy, grief. After looking around at them, grieved by the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. I repeated that verse too. Didn't realize it. He could empathize with us. And I've already had this verse a couple of times, so I'm not going to read it again. He was tempted like we are. He can empathize with what we're going through because he came to earth, he became human, he was tempted, he knows what we go through, yet he was without sin. Okay, I get to pick on Sharon now. He knew the law, so he could teach. So, Sharon, let me ask you this. After you completed your teaching, and then you read through the Bible, did you notice Jesus' teaching techniques or anything like that? Things that went, oh.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting how you do that? And probably the same thing with Sarah. After you completed your medical stuff and you read through the Bible, you went, oh, and things stand out to you that you'd never noticed before. Yeah, and that's just fascinating. The way, because of circumstances that changed in your life, and now you read a verse and you're going, oh, I get it now. Jesus knew his students' needs, their stages of development, physically, mentally, spiritually. He knew what they needed. He used various teaching techniques. And we're going to look at just a few from the Sermon on the Mount. He knew what the learning styles are. Everybody learns stuff differently. Some people are visual. Some people are audio. Some people watch YouTube. Do-it-yourself videos to learn how to do it. But there's different learning styles. There's hands-on stuff. Some people just dive in and try to fix it by themselves. The languages that he knew, at least 3 languages. While he was in Galilee, on his Galilean ministry, he most likely was speaking Greek to all of them. But when he goes to Jerusalem and in Judea, he's speaking Aramaic. And when he's sitting around talking to the lawyers and the scholars, they're probably discussing it in Hebrew. So, not only knowing what that student needs, being able to speak to him on his terms and in his language, and focused on his styles. And the tools, oh my word. And of course, COVID hit, and now everybody's having to do stuff online. Hi, we miss you. Jesus had a special ability to connect with all these people. And that's why he had the multitudes following him. We talked about the fact that he was connected and he was compassionate, and of course he could do miracles. That was entertaining, fascinating. And the thing that fascinates me about the miracles, like the man who he'd restored his hand. Okay, if you've had an injury and you haven't been able to use a leg or an arm for an extended period of time, several weeks, what do you have to do? Rehab. Yeah. Let's send them to rehab so they can relearn how to use that hand. This man had a withered hand, probably had never used it. And the miracles that amaze me are the ones that they're lame. And he heals them, and they get up, and they're leaping and praising God. How long does it take a toddler to learn to walk? They got to work on their balance, their motor skills, one foot in front of the other. It's not something that you just suddenly you're healed and you can just take off. That just amazes me. His teaching methods. Verbal instruction, Sermon on the Mount, a lot of that was just verbal instruction, but he also had some challenging statements in there that made people think. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Thought-provoking questions. Who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? Back to the Sermon on the Mount, painting a word picture. And of this multitude that's come out to hear him speak, how many of them do you think were hungry and thirsty? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Telling a story, the parable of the sower. And can't you see him? He's getting ready to speak to the people, and this guy comes out to start sowing seed in the fields. And he uses that illustration to tell a story to the people about the parable of the sower. Using object lessons, having a child stand in the middle of them, and then using that child as his illustration, where they see the widow put her mites into the collection. And then an example, showing the apostles, the disciples, how to wash feet, washing their feet. Jesus knew hard work. He worked for years as a carpenter, using all hand tools. About 40 BC, the Romans invented a water-powered grain mill. And they even modified it to make it knead the bread for them. A water-powered stone mill wasn't until about the 3rd century AD. Again, thank you, the Romans. It wasn't until the 1500s that somebody thought, hey, let's make a sawmill that the water can turn. So he probably had calloused hands, blisters on blisters. Go cut the wood, haul the wood back to home, the shop, to build whatever he was going to build. John 9:4 says, we must perform the deeds of the one who sent me as long as it is daytime. Night is coming when no one can work. Commentaries, they talk about the fact that he probably most likely worked during the daytime and then, at dusk have acquaintances over for a meal or something, get together with some friends. Heading to Golgotha, the carpenter is having to drag his cross to Golgotha, out to be crucified. Kirk Brothers, we're about done. His advice, don't let anyone outwork you. The devil never takes a day off. Never stop learning. One more verse. Colossians 3:23 and 24. Whatever you're doing, work at it with enthusiasm, as to the Lord and not for people, because you know that you will receive your inheritance from the Lord as the reward. Serve the Lord Christ. Questions? Comments? Yep.
I like that verse out of 2 Timothy you pulled up really quick, really soon, kind of linking the competence of staying in the Word with the confidence you gain with to be able to share the gospel. It's kind of like it's a continual effort, right?
Yeah.
That I don't know, but I just really like how that kind of linked together, I guess.
Yep. Well,
I was just gonna say that the Cliff Notes for the final exam is Isaiah 58 and Matthew 25.
Matthew 25. Okay. Anyone else? All right. So next week, we're going to talk about courageously calm. He could sleep in the storms. Jeff, would you lead us in a word of prayer to dismiss?